65 million years ago, dinosaurs fled the Earth to avoid an asteroid crash. 65 million years later, one dinosaur returned, only to discover a planet ruled by humans. And what a mess those humans have made. My name is Artius Zeradar. After pledging years studying the absurdity of the human race, I determined to right the wrongs of this inferior species by exposing its flaws. This is the Artius Zeradar Show. Alright, welcome to the Artius Zeradar Show. Last time I discussed the nature of categories, and I pointed out that categories, the study of categories, or I just call it categorization, that method is not a scientific method. The method of science is simply the experiment, right? Categorization has existed for millennia, far before the scientific method have ever emerged, and in many ways you could say it's simpler. It's a very simple method. Categories is because we teach it to our kids. I would argue that there's a lot of complexity to it, but in some ways we can say that it's simple. So yeah, it's wrong, I think, for these psychologists to claim that what they're doing is science when so much of it is just simple categorization. For example, the DSM-4, DSM-5 now, the DSM is a book of categories, and clinicians especially, I think the majority of their job is simply categorizing, putting people in particular categories, putting behaviors into certain categories, certain thoughts in the categories, and this, as I argued last time, is not scientific. And so we must no longer give them the kind of deference and respect that we do. We kind of raise their study as if it's something precise and rigorous and scientific, mostly. We give it such a deep respect because they claim to be scientists, but I argue, no, they're not being scientists very often. Moving on then, I'm going to move on now to the is-ought distinction. So is-ought distinction. Is-ought is kind of similar to the issue I had with the categories thing, right? So categories is kind of this, they are non-material things, so you can't make statements about non-material things if you're an empiricist. If you're being empirical and you're basing everything on the physical world and sensory observation, leaping into something non-material seems to me that you're going beyond the bounds of your methodology. And the same is certainly true of the is-ought distinction, even more so than categories. So the is-ought distinction is this kind of notion that there are things that are, I guess, so like say the world of is very separate from the world of what ought to be. Statements of is are totally different from statements of ought. And science is of that nature. Science is a thing that is, studies the world of is, and does not study the world of ought. But yet, in clinical psychology, you cannot escape the question of what one ought to do. So much of clinical psychology is based on that. So, for example, clinicians decide which cognitions you ought to have. Absolutely, they make that assertion. And it's the center of their study. Clinicians decide which behaviors you ought to have. Clinicians decide what therapy they ought to use. They do this, right? I mean, am I wrong? Now, you may not hear them phrasing it in that way. They probably do, though. I mean, I'll bet you catch them phrasing it that way all the time, actually. But you can't escape or deny it. When you go in to see a psychologist, and the psychologist tells you, well, we need to change, you need to alter your cognitive schema, or your cognitives are maladaptive. Well, why should I do the thing that is not maladaptive? Is that not an ought question? Why ought I not be maladaptive? By nature, it's an ought question. Before we dig deeply into this, let me just raise the is ought distinction. Historically came from, or at least is known for. Let me rephrase my sentence there. David Hume is known for the is ought distinction. And this might be a little tangential, but I think it's important to just examine and to ponder, because we're here to ponder and to ask philosophical questions. So let me raise a deduction of the day. Premise 1. Friendly is good. Premise 2. Saying hello is friendly. Therefore, conclusion, you ought to say hello. Now, this is not a proper deduction, because you'll notice in my premises I'm putting forth two is statements, and then I'm drawing an ought conclusion. And I think this is what David Hume was trying to assert, that two premises that are based on is cannot lead to an ought. And so therefore there's an is-ought distinction. Now I'm not sure if that's fully what he's saying or not. I haven't read deeply into this particular area of David Hume. I might need to do a bit more research. But if that is what he's saying, let me present a counter for a moment, just for the sake of countering. Could I not put forth the alternative deduction? Good actions are things you should do. Saying hello is a good action. Therefore, saying hello is a thing you should do. And here I'm trying to bridge is and ought. I'm trying to say that you can make should conclusions based on things that are. That proves that you can move from an is to an ought, right? Am I wrong? I might be wrong. I'm looking at those premises carefully, and it seems to me I've already linked the is and the ought in the first premise. So I'm not going strictly from is premises to an ought. Rather, I've already kind of asserted an ought in the first premise. I've kind of asserted the link between an is and ought in the first premise. And maybe that's what David Hume is getting at. I'm not sure. So I raise the deduction here to simply nibble on some philosophy here to get us thinking about things. Yeah, I don't know. What is it that David Hume's trying to say, and have I not proven him wrong? And I would argue I'm probably not proving him wrong. I think he probably is saying that the first two premises are is. They can't lead to an ought. It's interesting. So, yeah, I guess the question, I could counter my deduction by saying, should you do good things? Right. So I started with good actions are things you should do, but should you do good things? How do you figure that out? Yeah, it's actually a question I've raised to people who are quite religious. There seems to be this notion in religion that oftentimes is asserted as kind of proof for God, is that morality cannot exist, or rather that there are two views. The atheist view is that morality, well, there's different atheist views. One is that morality doesn't exist. Morality is relative, is one atheist view. But another atheist view that is less common is that morality does exist, but it doesn't depend on the existence of God. That it can exist without a God. And then the Christian will assert that, on the contrary, the Christian view makes more sense because they have a justification for morality. But I don't know if that justification really solves anything because of the is-ought distinction, right? Because you could say to yourselves, okay, ought you to murder someone? And one could respond, well, no, you ought not murder because it's against the Ten Commandments. It's one of the commandments is thou shalt not kill. And then the next question I would raise is, well, ought you to follow the Ten Commandments? And then the response would be, well, you should follow the Ten Commandments because they're commanded by God. And God is, as we said earlier, the reason for what ought to be, the reason for morality. But then it begs the next question, right? Ought you to obey God? Ought you to obey God? How do you answer that one? I think it is it is indeed this issue of the is-ought distinction. So yeah, this is a question for another day. I actually would like to come back to that, maybe in another video. But I want to get back to the question before us, which is psychology. So, putting all this aside, the is-ought distinction rightly applies to science. Right? Science is definitely not about oughts. Science is about is. Science is not a moral study. It is a study of the physical world. Morals are non-physical, non-material entities. And oughts concern morality. But not always, right? Oughts don't always concern morality. Things that you should do are not always about right and wrong. So certainly, oughts can concern things like wisdom or good practice. But still, regardless, these are still non-physical, non-material considerations, abstract considerations, way beyond the bounds of science. Yet what we find time and time again is that these scientists, these psychologists are all about oughts, raising questions of oughts, and yet claiming that it is science. And I assert that it is not. If you're asking all these questions of oughts and your whole study focuses on things like what ought your cognitions be, you are totally not being a scientist. Let's look at some examples. The main one is the cognitions, right? So you ought not dwell on negative cognitions. You ought to focus on positive cognitions. You ought to have cognitions that are not maladaptive. That's an ought, right? And my thinking is, what business is this of the psychologist to determine that you ought to have these behaviors or these cognitions? Questions of ought are extraordinarily deep questions. I don't think it's simply the nature of some scientific experiment can tell me what I ought to think or what I ought to say or believe or think. Maybe I ought to have maladaptive cognitions. What if those cognitions are true? So let's say there's a cognition that is simultaneously maladaptive and also true. Should you sacrifice that cognition for the good of being non-maladaptive? It's a really weird thing to say. Adaptive, I guess, is that the way you'd say it? That, I would argue, is absurd. I would most certainly pick truth. Truth is the way you go. So scientists concerned with what is, not what ought. Is there an experiment that says what one ought to do? Is there an experiment that they have that says, oh, you ought to do this? You ought to do this. So we did a hypothesis. The hypothesis was, should one do this thing? And then we did an experiment, and the experiment demonstrated it. Oh, yes, you ought to do this thing. I think that's complete hogwash. That's absurd that a scientific experiment is telling you what ought to be done. Is there an experiment that says that one ought to have positive affect? Right? Like this is I think the central assumption of psychology is that you ought to have a positive affect, but maybe you ought not. I don't think that's a question for science to ask if we ought to have a positive affect. I mean, I'll raise the counter, but my point is not even to focus on the counter necessarily, but rather to focus on who's raising the question. But Hitler, should Hitler be? Well, let's say Hitler, at the end of his days, he decides, oh my goodness, I need to see a psychologist. Should the psychologist say, oh well, after all these terrible sins you've created, you ought to feel good. We will help you to feel good. I would argue that that's not the case. But even if it is not the case or is the case, my main point is it's not a question for science. If you're going to argue with me on that, go ahead. That's fine. Argue with me, but I don't want to hear your psychologist arguing with me about that. Your psychologist has no more expertise in that arena than anybody else. Is there an experiment that says that we ought to be healthy? It's assumed we ought to be healthy, but ought we? And how do you come to that conclusion? Again, it's a conclusion that is not built on science. These are considerations completely prior to any scientific experiment. And these assumptions are so profoundly built into psychology. You've got to, there is this notion that science is objective and it's not built on beliefs. But all of this is built on beliefs. These are beliefs. Now, let me try to counter what I just said. So maybe the counter would be, no, we as psychologists, we're not telling you what you ought to do. You came to see us because you wanted something. You wanted us to provide some type of service. Now, we're not telling you whether you ought to be this way or ought not. We are simply doing our job and showing you that if this is what you want, this is what you do. And that could be the argument. But then I come back and ask, well, what ought you to want? And indeed, the psychologist is answering that to patients. Like you don't go to see a psychologist and then the psychologist says, well, what do you want? Well, I would like to be psychopathic and be homicidal. Can you help me do that, doc? No, the doctor will immediately say, interesting that you would want to do that. That means that you have a mental illness and it needs to be corrected and fixed. Now, obviously, I'm not condoning being a psychopathic homicidal maniac, but my point is that to reach the conclusions they reach, they have to go through the question of ought. So they're not just in there to serve whatever wants that you have. They have determined what one ought to want. And is there an experiment that determines what you ought to want? I'd really love to see that experiment. If anyone here knows of an experiment that tells what you ought to want, please present it. Maybe I ought to want negativity. Again, I can actually come up with a number of scenarios where I could see that being the case, where one ought to feel negative or ought to want negativity. In fact, I can come up with some arguments where a person ought to be negative their entire life. Let's go forward, though. You ought to behave and study in school, right? This is something that the psychologist presumes. We know this with ADHD. The whole purpose of ADHD is to cure your... This is such a wild thing to say. To cure your illness of not paying attention to lectures. To cure your illness of not being able to focus on schoolwork. The wild thing is, if you look at the DSM-5, that is indeed its purpose. Like it talks about things like can't do their homework, can't focus on lectures. What? It's just this. I'm sorry. It's just the very core of the things being proposed sounds so unscientific. So you ought to behave and study in school. So I'm thinking of ADHD. I'm thinking about what I mentioned last time, oppositional defiant disorder. I'm thinking about conduct disorder. These disorders are focused all on the nature of the classroom. A lot of it is. And in fact, I think they derived from that. I think they came about because some psychologists realized, maybe we're getting a lot of these students. We should start making disorders based on the foundation of education and being a good student. But what business is it of the psychology to do this? Science is concerned with what is, not what ought. Is there an experiment that says that one ought to do this? Is there an experiment that says that one ought to obey authority? Is there an experiment that says we ought to be normal? Maybe you ought to disobey. Maybe you ought not accept teachers' assertions. I'm actually going to pull from one of their own experiments. Stanley Milgram, right? I mean, his whole assertion was the dangers of obedience. So, that'd be interesting. I'd be very curious to see how people relate that experiment in terms of conduct disorder. On the one hand, conduct disorder is saying that, this person has a disorder because they're disobeying their authorities. And on the other hand, we have Stanley Milgram demonstrating that obedience is not a good thing, that we shouldn't want to be overly obedient. But both of these psychologists are making assumptions. For example, Milgram is making an assumption that it is bad to electrocute someone at high voltage, which is what he does in his experiments. He created. Well, for those of you who are not aware of it, read it. I don't want to get to the depths of it, but he's making that assumption that it is bad. And obviously, I think it's bad too. I agree with him, but I didn't make that assumption scientifically. On the other hand, they're saying that it is bad to disobey your teacher. The other psychologists. So both, and again, they're jumping to a conclusion. They're not through science, but through what the rest of us are doing. We're all philosophizing and thinking about life, but they have no particular expertise about this kind of thing more than us. So again, not scientific. Maybe you ought not accept the teacher's assertions too. So yeah, I actually do think that you should not necessarily be particularly obedient to authority. In fact, that's what bred the Nazis, right? That's why the Nazis were who they were, is because they were so obedient. Someone didn't stand up and say no, and that was actually what Milgram was trying to point out too. Yeah, so, maybe someone's coming into the psychologist saying, oh, doc, I don't want to be rebellious. And the doc is saying, well, I will help you to achieve that goal of not being rebellious. That's very unlikely. Most of these people who, students that misbehave, they're not the ones voluntarily coming in there and saying, oh, doc, I got this problem with rebelliousness. It's usually the parents are probably bringing them in, or maybe some teacher suggesting it. But yeah, maybe one ought to want to be rebellious. Maybe that's a good want to have. I certainly think that in many cases it can be. Obviously, there are times and places, but yeah, I'm actually I'm a big proponent of rebelliousness myself. J.S. Mill, right? John Stuart Mill, the idea that on liberty, if you are just blindly obeying like an automaton, you're not really a human being. If you want to really assert yourself, then make decisions for yourself. Don't obey. Do things that are good because you want to do them. So yeah, there is not a single experiment in the universe that can tell me what one ought to do. Right? Am I wrong? If you want to make that claim, go for it. So yeah, questions of ought belong to philosophy or theology or ethics, right? These aren't scientific questions. Therapist's entire purpose is to tell you what you ought to do, or some might say to help you decide what you ought to do. The therapist is trying to find solutions, and solutions require choices, and the nature of choice is the question of ought. Therefore, the psychologist is engaged in a practice she is totally unqualified for. She claims she should be heard because she's a scientist. But scientists engage in experiments, and experiments don't engage in questions of ought. Thus, our entire society is being led astray. I'll leave you with that thought, because that is indeed what I think is going on here. And I don't think it was purposeful, to be honest. But I think that this science is leading our entire society astray, and the results are catastrophic. Extraordinary what the results have been because of this one field. All right, my name is Artius Zeradar. Thank you for watching.